We began our day with a conversation about Judeo-pessimism and Judeo-optimism. And I know that many of the rabbis who come here to RTS come from the American Jewish community, and we come with a mixture of optimism and pessimism as we think about the current situation in American Judaism and our hopes and dreams for the future of American Jewry. And so each summer at RTS, we always invite important American Jewish leaders to come and share with us their insights about American Judaism and their hopes and dreams and visions for the future of the American Jewish community. And tonight we are incredibly honored and privileged to have two important voices and leaders in the American Jewish community today. We are just thrilled to have Dr. Andrew Rehfeld with us, who is the new president of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the 10th president. Dr. Rehfeld is already a friend and a partner of the Hartman Institute and is looking forward to many years of being part of our faculty and being warmly welcomed here at the Hartman Institute. Dr. Rehfeld is a professor of political science and taught for many years at Washington University, also served as the president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. We also have with us tonight another friend and faculty of the Hartman Institute, visiting faculty, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the executive director of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, has been both a student here, has taught electives for us here at RTS, and we're thrilled to have here with us this evening. Jill has written several books on social justice, has been honored on the Forwards list of 50 most influential American Jews, and also Newsweek's list of 50 most influential rabbis in America. And we are very excited to hear both from Dr. Rehfeld and Rabbi Jacobs their thoughts about the future of liberal American Judaism and its relationship to Zionism. So we've asked each of them to present their vision in about 15 or 20 minutes each, to share their presentation with us, and then to engage one another in some dialogue. And finally, we'll open up at the end for some of your questions. So without further ado, we'll invite Dr. Rehfeld to address us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and good evening, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Danielle, Yehuda, and Lauren for inviting me to address you this evening on the topic of liberal Judaism and Zionism today. As the former CEO of the Federation of St. Louis, I've been singularly impressed by Hartman's commitment to deepening ongoing Jewish education for professionals in Jewish communities. I was reminding Danielle that we first met a year ago when I was looking for a connection between St. Louis formally and the Hartman Institute to come in to do community education. So I look forward to deepening our partnership and continuing it in a collaborative mode. I am glad to see five participants here from my former city with you, Rabbis Michael Alpert, Daniel Bogard, Karen Bogard, all alumni of HUC. In addition, from other institutions, Rabbi Mark Fassman, former St. Louisan, who was seminal and critically important in my re-engagement as a professional in Jewish life over 15 years ago, and I'm grateful for, and Maharat Rory Pickernice. Together they represent the diversity and vibrancy of the St. Louis Jewish community and the value of flyover land to American liberal Judaism. In my talk tonight, I've been asked to put forth a vision of liberal American Judaism in which Zionism is a component, and to do so in 20 minutes. Danielle, Yehuda, and Lauren, I'm flattered at your confidence that I can do this, not so much offer the visions that you've asked, but to do it in 20 minutes. And it was 20 minutes until just a few moments ago when I found out it was 15 minutes. It was simply a way of saying that I hope you will treat what follows as merely a sketch. I will try to do my best to be brief, but also want to say something of value. And let me begin by asking what precisely is the problem that we are seeking to solve or address. And here I would say that I don't think it's BDS on the left, I don't think it's Israel right or wrong on the right, nor do I even think it's the lack of civil discourse that infects our communities and affects America more generally. though that's a significant problem. I think, along with many others, I'm not original in saying this, that the biggest challenge we face is simply disengagement with Israel. And I think that this problem arises from the underlying philosophical rejection of the value of Judaism as a particularistic religious approach, and concomitantly a rejection of the value of being part of the Jewish people as a distinct people that is growing in certain pockets of liberal Judaism, certainly in America. And that challenge is closely related to the challenges of understanding how particularity as a value fits within a philosophical tradition of liberal Judaism, a tradition that emphasizes the universal over the particular. The answers to this problem of disengagement will ultimately be a set of practices, but those practices must be developed on the foundation of core ideas. And it's those ideas that I want to explore this evening, for I think that disengagement with Zionism and disengagement with Israel is in fact a significant abrogation of what liberal Judaism requires. So a couple of caveats before I start. First of all, by liberal Judaism, I refer to a set of ideas from which multiple movements and communities have emerged. Of course, the multiple institutions of Reform Judaism are founded upon liberal Judaism, of the Reform movement are founded upon liberal Judaism, but so are streams that identify themselves with, or certain parts of streams that identify themselves with the conservative, reconstructionist, renewal movements, as well as increasingly some that we might call orthodox. Second, the disengagement I'm speaking of is absolutely not disengagement by the main institutions or the leadership of those institutions, and certainly not of the Reform movement, and definitely not disengagement by Hebrew Union College. My predecessor, Nelson Glick, continuing the Zionism of President Stephen Wise before him, made a very early commitment to Israel, to Zionism in Jerusalem decades ago. It's an investment that we as a college institute continue to value, to grow as we invest further in our Toby family campus, just around the corner virtually from here on King David Street. Israel and Zionism is and will remain central to the training and education of our Reform rabbis, our cantors, our Jewish educators, our nonprofit managers, and we have almost 350 professional students and graduate students enrolled in our programs as I speak. In large part, what I'm expressing is my own conception of liberal Judaism as an underlying philosophical ideal that can help explain why this commitment to Israel and Zionism is so important to liberal Judaism, and how to address the challenges we face as particularity and universality remain in tension. Now, my talk tonight is structured in 4 parts. First, very quick 4 parts. I will outline to you what I take to be the distinctive philosophic disposition or underpinnings of liberal Judaism that involve the primacy of reason that instrumentally deploys Jewish religious practice to achieve universal goods of the good or the holy, the right and the just. Second, I want to explain why a broader understanding would be helpful to develop a sense of authenticity about their own liberal Jewish practice that is, as a Jew in the pew, I often found lacking among my peers in the pews in Jewish North America. And third, I want to explain how these principles can help shape an instrumentalist approach to Jewish peoplehood, to Zionism in Israel. And finally, I'll close with some thoughts, particularly for rabbis who are wary of addressing these issues, given the kind of blowback that we face, that is significant, that you face, and I know this, having led a federation, how difficult it is to navigate these conversations. So, beginning. A summary conception of liberal Judaism. As a philosophical ideal, this is what I take liberal Judaism to be captured by. And I want to say at the outset, I'll say this a couple more times, this is not original, but it's a distillation of a particular kind of view that I think that's supported in the text. I don't have time we can talk about that in comments. But number one, a commitment to the primacy of reason is what makes us distinctively human, B'Tselem Elohim. Liberal Judaism begins with a reflection of who we as human beings are in relation to the divine, that we're all created, B'Tselem Elohim, in terms of that which distinguishes us from other creatures. These key attributes you can come up with a list of your own: reason, free will, imagination, self-awareness, consciousness, the capacity for empathy, for joy, the capacity for feeling, suffering, and an appreciation of beauty. Of these, as a liberal theory, liberal Judaism places reason above all else as our ship's captain, guiding our other capacities, whether joy or beauty or exercise of free will. and thus does reason set the terms for our encounter with the world, with all aspects of it, and ultimately our struggle with the divine. That's number one, the primacy of reason. Number two, liberal Judaism is committed to the practices of Torah, Avodah, and Israel as instrumentally valuable. And I want to just note Rabbi Bogart, wherever you are. Where are you? There you are. We've talked about this before. That made no sense to anybody except for Rabbi Bogart. Okay. So number two, committed to the practice of Torah, Avodah, Israel as instrumentally valuable. Liberal Judaism, in my view, recognizes the instrumental importance of engaging in the practices associated with those three features. Number one, Torah, that we create and confront and understand our textual tradition as a living, dynamic tradition, providing a specific shared language to structure and understand our moral responsibilities and to make meaning of our existential place in the world. Number two, Avodah. Liberal Judaism is committed to meaningful ritual practice that causes us to reflect on the source of all being, developing our capacity for all, enhancing our appreciation for beauty, reinforcing our capacity for empathy, and fostering both individual discipline and strong associative bonds required for collective moral action. Number three, Israel. Liberal Judaism is committed to building and sustaining communities of Jews for the expression of these shared practices that connect through generations of history, forming part of our identity as Jews. So Israel in the broadest sense, given I'm talking about Zionism, I don't mean in this case as the state. Number three, we have the primacy of reason. Number two, the practices of Jewish life as instrumentally valuable. And number three, what are they instrumentally valuable for? To achieve the good, the holy, the right, and the just. Using reason as our guide, liberal Judaism recognizes that the specific Jewish practices of Torah, Avodah, and Israel are one of multiple paths in the world towards the true. We engage in these practices not for their own sake, but because we believe they are instrumentally valuable to achieving universal values, causing us to look upwards towards the good or the holy, sideways towards each other to achieve the highest ethical ideals, the right, and towards the communal foundations upon which we stand and must operate, pursuing justice structurally, institutionally, and by ensuring the highest moral character of our leadership. In short, the good or the holy, the right, and the just. So in short, liberal Judaism emphasizes that it's built on the primacy of reason, that embraces Torah, Avodah, and Israel for their instrumental value in achieving the good or the holy, the right, and the just. This, again, is not to break new ground in any way, even if it might be a specific articulation of what has come before. I also recognize that not all liberal Jews or accounts of liberal Judaism will agree on these aspects either. But it's central to my vision, at any rate, for what liberal Judaism is and entails and how it, frankly, operates functionally for many people. So number two, let me move quickly, the need to articulate a public conception of liberal Judaism. I acknowledge that most people who practice liberal Judaism, who call themselves liberal Jews of one variety or another, let alone those of you who do the sacred work of leading congregations and Jewish communities, may not be as interested as a political theorist is with underlying principles of philosophical foundations. So whatever one's view of liberal Judaism is, let me explain why having a clear and relatively simple public conception of first principles might be helpful. Number one, fundamentals ground us. They give our practices meaning and purpose. And I also believe they create a sense of authenticity that, in my experience, many who refer to themselves as liberal Jews don't always feel about the very practices in which they're engaged. Now, to be clear, again, I don't mean that rabbis or organizations lack this sense of philosophical core, nor that there aren't individual scholars and movements that have articulated what they take to be those undergirding principles. I just mean that many of us who are not rabbis, those of us who make up Jewish communities, the very charge that Lauren has given to me, sometimes cannot articulate what they take to be their particular manifestation of liberal Judaism. They don't always have a clear view. They don't always say, I'm a liberal Jew because I engage in Torah, Avodah, and Israel because I value the primacy of reason and I understand that those practices are instrumentally valued to the good, the right, and the just. Compare that by contrast to many halachic Jews, I would say all that call themselves halachic Jews, who despite the great range of ideologies and movements of halachic Judaism, ultimately rest on a very clear, different underlying philosophical view, a very clear, different from liberal Judaism philosophical view, but very clear, based on God, in fact, giving Torah to Moses at Sinai as an actual event from which everything else follows. It is the treatment of God, Torah, Moses, Sinai as the foundational core concepts that grounds, believed by faith by many to have happened, that grounds their approach to Jewish life, and in some ways maybe the differentiator, the most important distinction between halachic and liberal Judaism. I'm just looking for... So the fact that we can't articulate as a community a practice is clear, an idea of what it means to be a liberal Jew, I think has consequences for developing authenticity and community. So let me move quickly to number 3. I talked about what my conception of liberal Judaism is, number 1. Number 2, the challenge with not having a public conception that people can refer to quickly. And number 3, let me go to where does Zionism fit into this vision of American liberal Judaism. By Zionism, let me start, I mean a commitment to the control of state power by the Jewish people, or some subset of them, in order to secure their self-defense and promote their flourishing. Zionism is a form of ethnocultural nationalism, which I presume you know about given the week's study that you've been through, that aims to put the apparatus of the state in service to a particular culture. That exercise of power should, as a matter of justice, be limited by the same limits that apply to all governments and all exercises of power, respect for human rights, democracy, etc. Let me say that again. The exercise of power, whether for ethnocultural nations or for civic national nations like the United States, must be always limited by a conception of justice that regulates that use of power. And as with any ethnocultural nation state, governments of Israel are structurally in danger of overstepping the justifiable exercise of power in favor of the privileged group. That's true of Israel, that's true of Greece, that's true of Ireland, that's true of Japan. I mean, pick your favorite ethnocultural nation. It's just structurally the risks that they face when you put state power behind a particular group. I'd also add that Zionism since the early 20th century entails the exercise of power within the boundaries of where the state of Israel today actually exercises its power, though with the precise borders, of course, open for negotiation, as any number of clearly Zionist governments of Israel have done and proved in their willingness to do. So what then is the place of such a concept within liberal Judaism? In my view, liberal Judaism requires us to engage with Zionism for moral and religious reasons. Judaism requires us to engage, liberal Judaism, it's morally required because it is group affiliation, any kind of group affiliation, is instrumentally important to generate feelings of fellow sympathy to those who are not close by, and thus critically important to any conception of how one develops the human capacity to do justice. And religiously, that is specifically to liberal Judaism, Zionism is required because of the value and ease of Jews imagining themselves as part of the Jewish people, given their heritage, given our tradition, and recognizing the historic necessity and demands of justice of creating and maintaining a Jewish state. So the treatment of Zionism as instrumentally important is consistent with most conceptions of Zionism as a modern political movement. We can talk more about it. I really want to be respectful of the time, and by my count, I have about 5 minutes left. So I just want to say that, Leibowitz to me is the most clear on this from an Orthodox perspective, that the very definition of fascism is when the state itself becomes the object, becomes an end in of itself, intrinsically valued. So you have a great range from the secular to the Orthodox that understand the instrumental value of Zionism in the state to pursuing other ends. Now, the good news is that valuing Zionism is fully consistent with the conception of liberal Judaism. Since religious Jewish life for liberal Judaism is instrumentally valuable to help us achieve moral ends of the good or the holy, the right and the just, what are the moral problems that Zionism is instrumentally important to help us achieve? That is, that's the way you can understand the question of what the relationship ought to be. What is Zionism doing to help us achieve those core values? And there are 3 that I think we can clearly articulate. Again, I don't really feel like I'm breaking new ground here. You're probably all rolling your eyes, no duh. But It's okay. Hopefully, maybe the framing. Number one, self-defense. Instrumentally important to the self-defense of the Jewish people. Number two, flourishing, Jewish flourishing. And number three, the development of the strong cords of sympathy. I want to talk just a little bit about each of these as the instrumental value of Zionism in the Jewish state, again, from a liberal Jewish perspective. First, Jewish self-defense. Admittedly, the argument from self-defense is no longer as compelling as it was 70 years ago. The Jewish people today are not facing extinction, even as anti-Semitism is on the rise. But to demand that Jewish control of state power needs to be justified only when its existence is threatened is to create a solution that is impossible ever to redeem when we or any people need it the most. That's an entirely unoriginal statement. In fact, Walzer does a great job on the general principle in his classic Just and Unjust Wars, but it's surprising to me the extent to which folks on the political left, particularly in America, do not appreciate that argument. It's also equally surprising to me how often those on the right won't recognize the very fact of a changed situation. And I know Yehuda has beautifully articulated this in the public forum of the most important public space in our world today, Facebook. So one can, and I believe should, assert the self-defense argument in the absence of the immediate need of state power. Number two, a second instrumental argument for Zionism is based on its role in promoting Jewish flourishing. If liberal Judaism accepts that Torah, Avodah, and Israel, in the broadest sense, are important and necessary, then the development of more robust forms of these practices must also be valuable. And here the history of the last 70 years is a demonstration of the realization of the value of the state to foster a renaissance that many, Daniel and Yehuda in particular, have noted is simply unprecedented in our last 3,000 years. Now the problem, though, with both of those arguments from self-defense and Jewish flourishing is that in a time of great strength, as well as in Jewish flourishing at any time, is that they are bounded by the limits of the just use of state power by others. That is, absent existential threats, the exercise of power is and must always be justified and limited, but to an even greater extent. Similarly, because Jewish flourishing is instrumentally important to the achievement of moral values, one cannot violate those values in order to preserve the very state that's instrumentally important to achieving them. To justify moral harm to others in order to secure greater Jewish flourishing violates the very understanding at the core of Jewish life that I'm understanding is the core component of liberal Judaism. And it also explains why it's entirely consistent to develop a robust liberal Jewish response to any exercise of power by any state, including Israel, as a matter demanded by the obligations of justice. And that's whether you agree with the substantive critique that Trua and Jill has led, that's very important, or the substantive critique by the right on previous Israeli governments that they haven't been pursuing their vision of justice in a different way. The most promising instrumental argument that I have not heard developed in this context to cultivate a strong sense of connection in terms of Zionism and liberal Judaism requires us to cultivate a strong sense of connection to the Jewish people and thus to the state of Israel, based, again, not on the particularity of Israel per se, but based on arguments that were fully worked out in the 18th century, in the Scottish Enlightenment in particular, by thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith, and later receiving institutional expression by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who never realized were Zionists until today. And that is the observation, supported by significant research, that our capacity for justice as human beings requires us to develop strong cords of sympathy with others in order to be empathetic and compassionate. And this is where the idea of Jewish peoplehood is particularly powerful. As Jews, we have a ready-made story that can inspire people and inspires people on a weekly basis to act on behalf of those experiencing injustice thousands of miles away. Liberal Jews who choose to turn their backs on Israel and Zionists are not only turning their backs on their heritage, their sacred inheritance, they're also foreclosing a powerful way to instrumentally mobilize people for action for the sake of others. And this is ultimately why I believe it's an abrogation of liberal Judaism to disengage with Zionism in the State of Israel. I can talk all about the work of the Jewish federations, the creation of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and the power that American Jewish communities expressed in connecting with Jews that don't look like them, don't act like them, don't speak to them, simply because of the strong cords of sympathy that were connected out of a sense of connectedness through Jewish peoplehood. So that's the sketch. Finally, and I want to give the podium over to Jill. Those are the reasons that I believe Zionism and the Jewish people are important to liberal Judaism and fit fully with a rationalist and instrumentalist view of the approach. So if it's not original, and let's just presume it's more or less correct for the time being, as far as it goes, why are we disengaging? And I know that, number one, younger people are alienated from Israel in part because so many institutions have put up rules of engagement that limit the content of what we can discuss or the terms before we can even have the discussion. And that's a mistake in my view. And more importantly, it's a violation of our commitment to the use of reason in addressing the very things that addressing our world. The truth is that once you agree that any state has to respect moral limits on the use of power, if you expect to engage with people on a rational basis in pursuit of justice, you're going to have to allow the government of any state, including Israel, its policies and leadership to be the focus of both praise and blame, of support and criticism. I'm sort of suspecting this will be the focus of Jill's remarks, so we can explore that later. More troubling to me is what I'm seeing, and more in print, is rabbis in the pulpits disengaging from talking and teaching about Israel because of the charged nature of discourse and dialogue. I have spoken to so many rabbis in the last decade in particular who have told me, and other communal leaders, who've told me they don't feel prepared to speak out on the issues of greatest concern to them about Israel. They have a point of view, but they're worried that articulating it will alienate their congregations, cause distress by opening up factions who disagree with them, or even worse, lose their jobs and their ability to support their families. This is real, and we need to recognize that. And I know in the room, you know this, so I'm sort of speaking to the people not in the room about you and the threats. The threats to your livelihoods and congregations are not insignificant. And for others, quite frankly, you may still be trying to work through the complexity of the multiple issues, the history, the international politics, the politicians, to say nothing of the electoral system. And my scholarship is in electoral systems, among other things, and but that's a separate thing. So let me just make one recommendation about this. I think the two options that I've seen with rabbis and with other community leaders is either we have to preach about Israel or we have to basically say we can't talk about it. We either have to take a position and say what we think, or we have to give it up, or we have to believe there's no truth of the matter and every position needs an articulation. And I want to implore you that instead of preaching or disengaging, that we teach, that we take a page from the meaning of rabbi, of Rav, of what it means to be a teacher, and understand that the greatest teachers that you've all had, that I tried to aspire to, was not someone that tried to force an idea down your throats, but one whose provocative nature caused you to think hard about the very issue at hand that you never thought you might have an interest in, and number two, through their passion and engagement with the content and the subject matter, could actually inspire them to value the thing and begin to value study and engagement as itself an end to a broader ideal. So again, instead of preaching or disengagement, thinking about the role of teacher as somebody that challenges people to think by having open, free discussions with no preconditions about the state of Israel, the importance of it as an instrumental value to the Jewish people, Judaism, and also, of course, to liberal Judaism in America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Andrew. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about when we get to the discussion part. And thank you so much to Lauren and Danielle and to Yehuda for the invitation to be here with all of you. I want to share two stories. One is a recent story and one is 50 years old. Here's a recent story. A rabbi I know, one of Trua's 2,000 chaverim, was at a demonstration in support of immigrant day laborers, the people who stand out on the street and get construction jobs or other kinds of day jobs. She was chatting with one of the workers, and he said to her, "I know why I'm here, because I have to be, so why are you here?" She thought about it for a second, and she told me later, and she said to him, I also have to be here. Her sense of obligation, she explained, came from her own family's immigration story, her commitment to the city where she lived, and her understanding of Jewish labor laws. So that's one story. And here's an older story. It takes place in 1968. There are three brothers, Raphael, Joseph, and Isaac Mindick, who were the largest landlords in the South End of Boston. And they refused to perform some basic repairs for their tenants, who were mostly Black and Latino. A local Reform rabbi asked the Boston Beit Din, the Orthodox Beit Din, to deliberate on this case. According to one account by the grandson of the Av Beit Din at the time, Rabbi Samuel Korf, the court was reluctant to take the case. They didn't know if it was really in their purview. But then Rabbi Korf learned that the Mindicks had set up some of shell companies to hide their assets, and the names that they gave to these shell companies were EU, L'Ratzon, these are each one company, Imre Fi, Ve'Gion, Libi, Lefanecha, Hashem, I swear I can't make this up, Tzuri V'Goali. And if you're going to hide assets, don't call it Hashem, your shell company. So apparently pursuing deceit under the cover of a verse that's imploring God to respond to our sincere speech pushed Rabbi Korf over the edge. The Beit Din took the case, and ultimately they forced the Mindicks to repair their buildings, and they even fined them tens of thousands of dollars when they dragged their feet and didn't do it right away. These stories, for me, exemplify what commitment to halakha looks like. We all know that the legal codes divide halakha into 4 categories, and one of those categories is choshen mishpat, the set of halachot that address questions of how to build a just society that protects the dignity of every single human being created in the divine image. And we also know that we can't just have choshen mishpat. It doesn't stand alone. We also need the other 3 sections, the framework that includes detailed consideration of ritual practice, of prayer, of holidays, family relations, kashrut, life cycles, etc., etc. For example, we can't just have Shabbat every day of the week. We also need Sheshet Yamim Tavod V'Asita Kol Melachtecha. We need 6 days of advancing the work of creation. But then we also need those 25 hours just to enjoy divine creation without trying to change it. In this room, we obviously have very different relationships to halakha among us and to the idea of chiyuv, to obligation. So I'm not trying to dictate anyone's practice. I don't want to say that everyone should become a conservative rabbi, though it's not so bad. And I don't want to put up barriers to participation in Jewish life. But I do believe that liberal Judaism has to include a sense that there are mitzvot, which I'll translate as moral and spiritual imperatives that guide our lives, that compel us to act, and that these moral and spiritual imperatives can't be divorced from one another. That is to say, what's different about being a Jew and what's deeply countercultural in America is the sense that we don't act only out of what we feel like doing in the moment. It's not an individualistic choice. We act out of chiyuv, the sense that we have to be here. We know, for example, that the central lesson of tzedakah is that we give not because we like the person we're giving to or we know the person we're giving to, not because we're nice people or feeling generous that day, but because our tradition mandates a just redistribution of money. At least once a year, somebody puts out an article or a book that claims that Tikkun Olam Jews are destroying Judaism, right? You've all seen it, right? And that those of us who do justice work as Jews are just mouthing liberal slogans, that it's not connected to Judaism. So for most part, these writers are hacks. They haven't actually bothered to do their homework. They don't know what deep Torah is coming out of the Jewish social justice space, and apparently they also don't know about generations of halakha that tackle social and economic issues with as much passion as ritual law. But we also have to be honest and say that sometimes it is true that liberal Jews don't speak about our justice work from within the depth of Torah. As committed liberal Jews, I'll for the moment include everybody, you can decide whether you're in or not later, who believe in these spiritual and moral imperatives, we have to be able to answer the question, why is it different to do this work as Jews rather than as secular Americans? Part of this answer, as I've said, is chiyuv. We have to be here. And another part of the answer is claiming our religious and spiritual authority. We have to be going deep into our texts and traditions, not merely for validation, but also for ancient wisdom that can shape our thinking. That means taking seriously the long halachic conversations on criminal justice, how we redistribute wealth, relationships between employers and employees, and so much more. And this sense of chiyuv and engagement with our tradition also has to drive our relationship with Zionism and with the State of Israel. To accept a moral and spiritual imperative toward the State of Israel means that it's not an option either to abandon it nor to enable the worst behavior of its government. Rather, chiyuv means drawing on millennia of Jewish conversations about how to build a just society and about our responsibilities both toward Klal Yisrael and also toward non-Jews. It means engaging with Israel as a real place, not as a Zionist fantasy, as a projection of our own anxieties, or as a vehicle for working out questions about our own identities. It means that we have to be here because we care about the people here and about the future of a country that's the home to approximately 6 million Jews, as well as 2 million non-Jewish citizens, and that also governs the lives of some 5 million Palestinians living under occupation. And we have to be here because, like it or not, for much of the rest of the world, Israel does represent what it means to be a Jew, and that perception affects all of us in all of our relationships with other communities. Too often, the debates between the right, the left, and everyone in between focus on Zionism. But it's not really about Zionism anymore. It's not like we're sitting in a cafe in Vienna over a coffee debating whether Jews should demand a nation state of our own, right, in the 19th century. We're not in the 19th century. For the past 71 years, Israel has been a real country, a member of the UN like any other country, not some fantasy. So to really engage with Israel means engaging with Israelis and with what matters to them. I was struck, for example, that 3 of the major protest movements over this past year got very little attention within the US Jewish community. The first one, as most of you were here for, was when Ethiopian Jews and allies shut down streets to protest the killing of an Ethiopian immigrant at the hands of an off-duty police officer. Michal, I don't see her, but she wrote a great piece about why Americans should care about this, why American Jews should care. And second, the Jewish and Arab women, and also men, who went on strike earlier this year in response to government indifference about violence against women. And third, LGBTQ and straight Israelis who protested discrimination against gay couples who want to create families through surrogacy. So why do American Jews pay so little attention to these protests, to these issues? Maybe it's because none of them fits neatly into one of the 2 convenient ideological narratives that typically frame the debate about Israel and the United States, either romantic hasbara or condemnation. When real live Israelis, not Zionist or anti-Zionist cartoons, are fighting for their rights and their lives, we have to be here. That's chiyuv. We have to get to know Israeli civil society and human rights leaders and partner with them, particularly as they face intensive government incitement against them. We have to know about that, and especially as both of our countries, as well as others, are facing the rise of autocracy and attacks on democracy. Now, it's easy to visit here and live in a Zionist fantasy. We can post on Facebook and say, I'm home, I'm weeping at the airport, and to share all of our Only in Israel stories. And those are real, right? We can get emotional about this place, I do too. But we also have to engage with the very real political and social crises here. That's what our chiyuv demands. Now, foremost among these, of course, is the occupation, which is without doubt the greatest moral stain on this nation and the greatest threat to its future. Wow. Sometimes I get booed when I say the word occupation. So our chiyuv demands acknowledging that our own American Jewish community, as well as the American government, bears some responsibility for enabling and entrenching this ongoing occupation. Too many in the American Jewish community have spent decades giving lip service to the 2-state solution, which I still believe is the only solution that has a chance of working, even while funding and enabling the expansion of settlements. Too many of our communal institutions have poured our shared resources into defending Israel from criticism, discrediting the Palestinian narrative, and criticizing those who influence Israel from the progressive side, even spending so many communal resources into fighting BDS, which is not the battle that we should be fighting. In the meantime, we've said way too little about the billions of dollars that the far right, both Jewish and Christian, pours into building settlements, into transforming the media landscape here, into directing public policy, and into supporting a prime minister steeped in corruption. To be clear, We have to refuse to entertain complaints about progressive Jews trying to change Israeli policy. The how dare you sit in your comfortable living room in New York and tell Israelis what to do, that argument. We can't entertain that argument at the same time as we have billionaire American Jews like Irving Moskowitz, Alav Shalom, and Ira Rennert buying settlements that are changing facts on the ground, or the Tikva Fund, led by another American billionaire, Mem Bernstein, which is investing millions of dollars in trying to drive Israeli policy toward American-style libertarianism. It's one of the most dangerous influences in Israel today. Or we have Sheldon Adelson's newspaper, which is propping up the prime minister and weakening independent media. And we have the Central Fund of Israel, which is investing more than $20 million a year of U.S. tax-deductible money to extremist and even Kahanist organizations here. Torah has been complaining to the IRS about this since the two main Kahanist organizations are on the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations. We still have more than $20 million a year of U.S. tax-deductible money going to organizations like this, and some of that money even flows through our federations and our Jewish communal funds. I have to believe that these billionaires have way more comfortable living rooms than any of us do. I want to offer these examples to emphasize that the right wing is not shy about proactively remaking Israel in their own vision of a fundamentalist fortress allied with autocratic and anti-Semitic governments and with Christian evangelicals. And at the same time, while they have no problem doing that, sometimes there's a tendency within liberal communities to say that we have no agency or authority to have an influence on Israel. Doing that is distancing ourselves from our chiyuv. I've heard many people within our communities say that they're very sorry about the occupation, but there's nothing to be done. There's no partner. There's no guarantee that a Palestinian state would live in peace with Israel. Maybe we can take small steps to ameliorate Palestinian suffering. Maybe we can pursue a kibush na'or, an enlightened occupation, but a long-term solution is impossible. That kind of moral rationalization for doing nothing is appealing, and even seductive. But it's not Zionism. It's defeatism. The primary innovation of Zionism was the idea that Jews could take history into our own hands rather than letting other people make our history for us. Waiting for the perfect conditions, for the perfect partner, all while entrenching the status quo and in fact making the situation much, much worse every day, that's a cowardly position, not a Zionist one. As Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, a Sarajevo-born rabbi and one of the founders of religious Zionism, wrote, "The redemption will begin with efforts by the Jews themselves. They must organize and unite, choose leaders, and leave the lands of exile." Now, he was obviously talking about physically leaving the diaspora, but too many of us have internalized the diasporic sense of powerlessness in our approach to our very own Jewish state. So to those of us who feel powerless or who feel hopeless, here's a lesson we can learn from the right wing. Know what you want, keep your eyes on the prize, and never give up. We've learned this both in the United States and also in Israel. In the US, since 1973, the anti-abortion movement has spent 40 years since Roe v. Wade figuring out how to unlose. Because you know what? They lost, but they've been unlosing, and we're seeing those results right now. And the same way, the right wing here has spent the decades since Oslo doing the same, unlosing. Building outposts, getting those outposts legalized, securing leadership of the government and of the military, and even putting Kahanists back into the running for Knesset. So instead of sinking into despair, let's reconnect with our sense of obligation, of chiyuv, our moral and spiritual imperatives. Let's engage our communities in creating the Israel that we want. And let's also do that in partnership with Israeli human rights leaders and political leaders who share that vision and are working for it on the ground. To be clear, what we're working for, what we should be working for, energetically and unapologetically, is an Israel with a strong democracy, in which all citizens, Jewish and Arab, are equal, both legally and really. It's an Israel that's free from the moral stain of occupation and from sending its teenagers to administer the lives of another people. It's an Israel in which women, LGBTQ people, and Israelis of all colors are protected from violence and have full and equal rights under the law. That's what it means to embrace our chiyuv, to say, we have to be here. This is not just a secular or liberal vision, it's one that's deeply grounded in Torah. And we, as rabbis, have to make this explicit by teaching and speaking from the depth of traditional texts about how we live with Jews and non-Jews and how we create a just society. This past October, I sat with several dozen rabbinical students of all denominations who are taking part in the Torah Human Rights Program during their year in Israel. Some of you might know more than 70% of students who come here for the year, for a semester, take part in Torah's program, which introduces them to human rights issues on the ground and to human rights leaders and political leaders here. I saw these students just a few days after our staff had brought them to Hebron in partnership with Breaking the Silence. If any of you haven't had that experience, please talk to me afterwards. It's necessary. I asked the students about their experience, and they told me two things. First, how crushed they were by seeing the reverence that was paid to the grave of Baruch Goldstein, which is located in Meir Kahana Park, just outside of Hebron. And second, by the violent ways in which the settlers live in that city. And they said to me, the settlers are so clear about why their presence there is based in Torah. What's our Torah? What's our Torah? We have to be able to answer that question. So we spent some time studying together, and I shared with them a series of midrashim that place ancient and bloody religious and familial conflicts in the city of Hebron, and also that consider the question of what is Marat HaMachpelah? What does that word even mean? One of these midrashim suggests that Marat HaMachpelah is called that because it's kaful, it's double. So the question is, what do you mean it's double? How is everything arranged? And the midrash suggests that it's either doubled because the graves are side by side, or because they're stacked on top of each other. So what's at stake in this midrash? What's at stake is the question of how we're supposed to live together in a holy place. Do we live side by side with our neighbors, or do we live on top of our neighbors, having power over them? We have to have our own Torah. We have to reject any notion that biblical literalists who see absolutely no difference between Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, the modern state that's a member of the UN that has human rights obligations. We have to reject any idea that those biblical literalists have exclusive rights to religious or political authority, because our own Torah is just as authentic, just as legitimate, and just as binding. I would argue even more so. So living our lives according to moral and spiritual imperatives means that we refuse to allow anyone else to hand us our history. It means refusing to cede our Torah to fundamentalists. It means rejecting defeatism and doubling down and ensuring that both of the places that we care about, the place where we live, the US or another place, and also Israel, live up to our vision. It means claiming both our authority as religious leaders and the authenticity of our Torah. And it means partnering with Israelis to defeat the anti-democratic forces that threaten us both. And we do that because of our chiyuv, because we have to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both for your thoughtful presentations. We're going to begin our Q&A by giving our speakers the opportunity to ask each other a question. So Andrew and Jill, if you had a question for each other.
Don't you think is this on? Hello? Can you hear me? I'm not sure these are on yet. Very good. My question to you is, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah? My question to you, can you hear me now? Yeah. There's a great Saturday Night Live skit with Garrett Morris that references that. My question to you is, don't you think it would be better to open this up to dialogue now from them than offer one another?
I would agree, though, Lauren's in charge, so.
I do have a question then. What? There we go. What is the basis for chiyuv? That is, why do we have to be here? What is, you're talking to liberal Jews who tend in America to just want to be disengaged. Mm-hmm. How is coming to them and saying, you have to be here, actually going to get to the ends that you and so many of us, I think, are interested in achieving? How does that actually motivate the kind of action that you're talking about?
Sure. Well, first of all, you can't lecture people who don't care about a country that they have to care about a country. So the question is how we get people to care about a country. I think part of that is by introducing the people in our communities to Israelis, and particularly to Israelis who are trying to make change here. Certainly, I mean, many or most of our communities, we try to bring people to Israel to engage with it on the ground, to see what's happening here. And the other piece is, I mentioned this before, but even for people who might want to say, you know what, I want nothing to do with that country in the Middle East. What do I care? I have a really nice life in the US. It's actually not so simple, because we all know that Israel takes over so many of the conversations. And even people who are, sometimes when we in our communities talk about the people who are disengaging, they're not actually disengaging. They're engaging in a way that is different from perhaps the way that some of us might want them to engage. It's like there's a lot of engagement with Israel, maybe even more engagement than there used to be. And people are engaging because you actually can't be a Jew in America, at least not a public Jew, without in some way having what's happening here affect your life. And so part of the question is, can we present a vision that would make people feel like it's a positive thing to engage here, to give examples that are of people who they actually want to be in relationship with. So can I ask you a question just at the very end of...
No. No, yes, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, when you said, look, you can't just preach about Israel, you have to teach about it. I'm curious if you've seen some examples of that you feel like are really stellar examples of that kind of teaching that would be the ideal way to get people engaged.
You know, I'm going to call out the people here from St. Louis. We've done something that was really, I think, kind of visionary in St. Louis in terms of the forum that we created to support open dialogue at the Federation. Not every Federation practices policies that you and others think are awful. Federations are very important conduits to justice and building of Jewish peoplehood.
You don't have any money going to CONUS, as far as I know.
Correct. But at any rate, so we've created a forum. You see, they're taking over anyway. But look, I early in my tenure in 2014, during the heat of the Gaza war, when I was in Israel and we came back to St. Louis with a group that was here, and I led a trip, there was a fist fight that broke out in the crowd that we had to break up, and based on the idea that that's not who we are as a community. And that seemed to me to be a shifting point in St. Louis by just holding ground and saying it isn't about this or that, elu ve'elu. It's about elu ve'elu. It's about entertaining both positions, but showing the passion of engagement. So I do think that being a tenured professor at Washington University on leave allowed me to take certain risks that most Jewish professionals are not willing to take. So I take the point, but I do think that showing the passion, people are attracted to people that are passionate about certain. People are attracted to the movement that you have created because of the passion with which you speak and inspire people. I mean, let's just put it out there, and it is motivating. And I would say you're a great example of what I'm talking about, even for people that disagree with the content of what you say.
So I'm going to start with 3 questions. Let's try to start with people who have not yet asked a question during RTS this summer, and then we'll take another round of 3. Yes, Rabbi.
A question for Dr. Rehfeld. You said in your talk, for which we all thank you very much, that the Reform movement has always emphasized the universal over the particular. And I wonder if, with all due respect, if that may be a mistake, and that we should not elevate either one over the other. And that, for example, the 2 prayers between the Baruch Hu and the Shema, one is about universal God and his power, the other about how he loves Israel in particular. And that we might come into some danger in trying to elevate one over the other. Our committees said, give me a place to stand and I will move the world. Would you please clarify a bit more?
Certainly. So I want to begin. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Please, I apologize.
Okay, 2 more questions, and then Rabbi Splansky will come to your answer first. This is the first. Yes, Susie.
I think this is more for Rabbi Jacobs, but you both might have something to say on it. How do you respond to people who say liberal Judaism has gone wild with Tikkun Olam and that's not real Judaism? What are some of the responses that you found most effective?
Great, we'll take one more. Please, Greg.
So I'm very glad that I didn't ask a question yet during RTS, so I could save my question for now. What I'm not glad about is that my children, in particular my daughter, was not here to hear Rabbi Jacobs, you speak, because I don't know what to say. But my question is, where is your chiyuv coming from? Where is it coming from? That's my question.
I'm happy to go to defer.
Why don't you start with her?
Sure. So, Rabbi Splansky, thank you. I want to make two clarifications. One clarification, then I'll answer the question. I was not making claims about the reform movement. I was making claims about the underlying principles that inform any movement. Movements are collections of institutions, of actors, of social organizations. Civil rights movement is a good example. There wasn't one institution that represents the civil rights movement or one leader. And the reform movement, as a collection of institutions, has taken any number of positions. So I just want to be clear. I'm not speaking for the reform movement. I was articulating a view of liberal Judaism, the underlying philosophical principles from which movement develops their platforms, etc. In terms of the universal versus particular, I agree that there's a long tradition of valuing both. I do think you need to ask the question, which is in service to the other? In the beautiful metaphor, the teaching that Rabbi Jacobs did, is one on top of the other or side by side? I appreciate the view that they should be viewed side by side. I don't believe that is. I don't believe that's the proper or the best way to think about them. I think that the particularity has to be in service to the universal because the particularity is subordinate to the universal. So that's what I would say on both of those.
Susie, the question of when people attack liberal Jews and say it's just Tikkun Olam, like, let's teach texts and old texts. I mean, we have no small number of old texts that are very radical or more modern texts. I mean, anybody who's ever spent any time with me knows that one of my favorite people to teach is Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, who has some incredibly radical tshuvot on economic justice issues. And he would probably not be super excited to hear that I'm teaching him all over the place, but you know what? Like, his tshuvot on policing, on prisons are way more radical than any thing in the conversation in America, I have to say. So, like, let's teach these texts. Let's talk about them. And then Greg, right? Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
If I could answer Rabbi Moskowitz as well. I think this is a great example of to the extent that liberal Jews are exposed to the critique that it's all about Tikkun Olam, it's because, to Rabbi Splansky's point, they've left the particular on the table and they move immediately to the universal. And I think the path that Rabbi Jacobs is presuming is a very good path to re-engage with tachlis, with particularity, with what it is about our tradition that demands the call, that demands us to use it instrumentally to achieve Tikkun Olam. But we're all motivated by Tikkun Olam, and we have the bigger challenge of understanding the role of particularity in order to ground the universal.
And then the question about chiyuv. So in the broad sense, I live in a halachic system, right? I'm a conservative rabbi. I take that very seriously. That's the framework that I operate in. We can talk about that at length another time. We talked about it over coffee. But I'll say something more personal about this place on two levels. So in 2009, I came here for a year to be at the Mandel Institute as in their Jerusalem Fellows program. And my husband and I came with a 4-week-old baby, which is kind of ridiculous when you think back on it, but we did it. And because my husband was born here, his family is Israeli immigrants who moved to Cleveland when he was a baby. Our daughter had automatically had dual citizenship, which, I have to say, it's pretty hard to deal with one passport within 4 weeks. And we certainly did not figure out all the paperwork to deal with a second one. And so we got to the airport, and at Ben Gurion, they looked at all, his passport and my passport, and they said, well, where's her Israeli passport? She can't enter on an American passport. And we're like, well, she's 4 weeks old. Like, do you want to babysit, right? Right. So, but they were clear that she was not going to leave on without an Israeli passport. So, I'll spare you all the bureaucracy. But at the end of the day, I basically looked at this little tiny baby who's like that big. She's got 2 of the weightiest passports in the world. And I felt like, okay, what am I going to do about both these countries? And I was previously working on domestic issues, and I felt like I couldn't just do that anymore. And the second part of the chiyuv is about the people here. I feel like Avner just walked in at the perfect moment. Hi. But just in my work, in my life, I'm so connected to Israelis who are working really hard every single day and taking great risks to build the country that they want. And so there's a relation. If we really believe in Klal Yisrael, if we really believe we have obligations to the Jewish people and to this country, which includes obviously Jews, non-Jews, then we have to take that seriously and care about the people here. Sorry to embarrass you just after you walked in.
Okay, we'll take a second round. Yes, Amy.
So I just want to ask, where is the place in liberal Judaism for people who are struggling as they analyze the conflict here? Last summer or 2 summers ago, I can't remember, when we talked about what was going on, one of the things that happened time and again is I thought I understood an issue from one presentation, and 2 nights later I realized I knew nothing. And so I just wonder, what is the person who thinks that they can understand what the Israeli government has done wrong in one instance do when it's complicated and you think you've got it, and then the next presenter shows us that, well, there's a different perspective, and how does that person find their place in liberal Judaism?
Thank you. All the way in the back.
Hello. As one of the rabbis who's afraid of his congregants and trying to keep his job and pay for his children, so I hope this is a safe place to ask the question. So when congregant Poloni says, "But Rabbi, if we how do I say this? I mean, it's so obvious that I feel embarrassed to ask the question, but when we go so democratic, we'll lose our Jewish identity, or we won't have a Jewish state." How do you respond? I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I have a problem holding that with the national. I guess it's about the national state and the religious state and our position in holding that tension.
Arnie? Yeah.
So, Rabbi Jacobs, I'm listening to your discussion of a chiyuv that underlies justice issues. I understand that in the halachic framework. But from a grounding in a sense of mitzvah, what I haven't heard from you yet, and what I wonder whether you might expand upon, is the sense of chiyuv that comes from mitzvah as being mitzuvim by a mitzaveh, and the idea that there is a theological underpinning to our relationship to Israel, land and state, to its people, and to issues of, Jews, non-Jews. All of these are within the halachic system. Where's the theological grounding of that halachic thinking? Where's your theological basis?
Okay, so the question of complexity. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity here, and the danger is getting stuck in the complexity, because at some point you have to do something, and there is a danger that we're just going to say it's complex, and as I said, the people who don't think it's complex and have a vision that might not be our vision are going to just go ahead and create their fundamentalist society. So let's not get stuck in that, and let's actually have a vision and start to create it and not be afraid of that. And in terms of if it's so democratic, will it be a Jewish state? I think this is also a question of vision. What do we want to create here? I mean, one of my fears about this state is that it's going to destroy Judaism, because, I mean, when Israeli friends will say to me, for me, Judaism is the fact that I can't go out and buy diapers for my kid on Shabbat. Somebody recently said that to me. Like, that's so painful. Like, all of us could come up with 1,000 positive things about, I mean, we're rabbis, right? Like, there's 1,000 things that we would want people to know about Judaism way before anything about whether you can go shopping on Shabbat. And so that is my fear. And the real question is, well, what are we going to create here, right? The status quo is untenable. So let's have a vision for how we're going to have a Jewish democratic state that's both. Let's figure out what that means. There are going to be non-Jews who are citizens here. What does it mean to be a Jewish state? Like, these are questions that, there's a lot of answers to that question, to those questions. For me, it has to be democratic, and hopefully it will be a place that allows for the flourishing of Judaism, which means also that it can't be coercive. In terms of the theological underpinnings, I mean, that's a huge question. I'm not exactly sure which way to go into it, but it goes back, of course, to the relationship with God and the sense that what we're doing is, like I said, about tzedakah. It's not about how I feel, my own sense of what I want to do, but it's about some kind of divine service, in a sense that I'm living my life in divine service, that I'm probably not going to see the end of, certainly none of us are going to see the end of what we would want to create, but to feel like we're all part of some step in divine service. And as we both mentioned, a lot of, when we think about building a society, we always start with the idea of Tselem Elohim, and we could talk for hours about what exactly that means, because it's not just, oh, everybody's created an image of God, that's so nice, but like, it's very deep to think about what does it actually mean to create a place that respects the dignity of every single human being, no matter who they are, no matter whether we like them or don't like them or are scared of them or anything else. I think it's important that a lot of the places that our tradition really takes up the question of Tselem Elohim are places like criminal justice, where the person that you don't want to run into a dark alley, like, let's really insist on that person's Tselem Elohim. So for me, those two pieces, and we can have a whole other theological conversation another time.
So, Rabbi Gluck, that was her theology. That's my answer to you. The other two rabbis who asked the question, very, very closely related, because they deal with the complexity of the issue and how to navigate it. And I want to say two things about this. And I don't know your name, I'm sorry. Amy. It's complicated. It is complicated. I would say, number one, as a good teacher for you both, you don't have to know all the answers. It's okay to sit in a position of saying, I don't know, if somebody asks the question. And I will say I had the opportunity of speaking briefly at the ceremony yesterday where we named one of Aaron Pankin's of blessed memories professorships, named professorships. And I spoke, and she's in the audience, Rabbi Andrea Weiss, who's our provost. And I had used the term about who recognizes her own limitations, because it was first wrote that paragraph in terms of the Mosaic model of leadership, somebody that had both the humility and the courage at the same time. The courage, certainly Andrea has done in this past year, to lead and lead strongly, but not let that become hubris. Why? Because she and Moses have the humility of knowing their own limits. So I would say the same to you. Know your own limits in leading, and I don't know is a perfectly acceptable and respectable answer. I will say that a technique that I have found very helpful in engaging people without tipping my card, so I'm not preaching but I'm teaching, is to think about the logical implications of certain views. Is it Jewish or is it democratic? You add, do we keep the territories, right? So you have three positions. You can have two out of those three. You structure them, you show them. Jewish and keep the territories, non-democratic. Jewish and democratic, don't keep the territories. Democratic and keep the territories, it's not Jewish. And ask them which do they think is the right combination. You don't take a position, but you help them think through those issues, and you show your passion of applying reason and judgment and argument straightforward. There are other examples. The nugget, the canard, this idea that the Jewish people, like all other peoples, has a right to their own nation state, is false. Not because the Jews don't have the right. They do. I've said that. I defended it. It's on video, so I want to quickly say that. It's because if all other peoples had that right, there are roughly 4,800 peoples in the world, about 195 nation states. Do the math. do you really want a world in which that's realized? So then what are the rights that ground when states can have it? Does Israel meet those rights? You can engage without taking the position and show your passion about ideas, about politics, express some humility, as well as lead other people to engage their passions around these issues. And get tenure at a major university.
We're just going to take 2 more questions. Yes, please, Joe.
Thank you. I was also very moved by Rabbi Jacobs' presentation, especially the kind of the language about justice. But justice doesn't kind of emerge self-evidently from our books, right? Which is to say we can all be passionate about justice and at the same time recognize that there are serious disagreements about what it is that justice requires. One thing that troubles me about this sort of attempt to fix American alienation from Israel with activism is that it ends up being, I think, a kind of a hyper-parochialism, where we have very kind of set views about what justice requires that emerge from our own cultural context, and then we travel to a land that's not our own, although except in some sort of conceptual way, and decide that that is what must be imposed here right now. And it's a little disturbing to hear it described as what reason requires, which is to say there are very reasonable people here as well who come to very different views. And I come back again and again to the Pew Report, which says shocking things about American ignorance about Israel. Half of Americans can't read the Aleph Bet. A negligible number can carry a simple conversation in Hebrew. And yet our first point of interaction is to come as activists and to impose a very particular vision upon the proper settlement of the conflict here. And I suppose I just want to share my discomfort with that and ask you to address those.
Aaron.
Yeah, I think it's be loud enough. So it's kind of a connected question. So one of the cardinal rules of pastoral counseling is theology is not therapy. That we can't go into that room presuming to solve something or come up with some chachmas of some kind. That the first thing we need to do is sit with that person in their pain, in their anxiety, in their fear, and validate it for its own sake. And certainly if we feel like we want them to hear anything that we have to say. So what is the balance of theology and therapy in this conversation?
Okay.
Okay. So, Joe, so just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the very first thing that everybody, that we say to people right away, okay, the first way you engage with Israel is to become an activist, and you just do it completely divorced from anything that's actually happening here. And I would actually say that that's a problem with how a lot of Israel education actually does go in America, right? That we're trying to train our kids to counter what people will say to them on college campuses, but actually we haven't taught them anything. We're just giving them the AIPAC myths and facts. I also memorized those before college, but I was confused about which were the myths and which were the facts, I think. But
That's a great one.
So first of all, we have a responsibility to teach, right? We can't, sometimes we're so afraid of having people see anything that's not perfect about this country because we want to live in the Zionist fantasy and maybe they're only going to go once in their life. And so we just want everything to be perfect. And that's not actually education. So we have to think about how we present Israel in a way that we're actually engaging with it. I always give the example that my older daughter in her school, she's going to be in 5th grade, but in 2nd grade, they did a whole year-long unit on how people got to New York. And they started not how immigrants got to New York, but how people got to New York. So they started with the Lenape, the native tribe that was native to our neighborhood. And so they learned, they learned about the geology and how, et cetera, but they learned about the genocide and, 2nd grade, and they learned about, they had a dad of one of the kids come in and talk about how his family had come up in the Great Migration, so they learned about Jim Crow and they learned about the KKK. Like, kids are not stupid. Like, she can deal with being American and and also know about the KKK and about the genocide of Native Americans. And like, she could also tell you about the occupation, and it doesn't mean that she loves Israel any less. So we can have complicated education, not be afraid that that will make people disengage. And then the second piece, as I said, the work that we do has to be in partnership with people here. So we need to know the civil society organizations, the political leaders who share the vision that many of us have, hopefully, for a democratic Jewish state here. We need to know the human rights organizations, and we need to be partnering with them. And I'll also say, I said this briefly, but when we have a Trump and Bibi alliance, as well as Orban and Putin and fill in the blank with all of the other autocratic leaders, that's very dangerous for Jews. We know that we don't do well in autocracy, if we know anything about history. And so we really have to have partnerships that are going to fight that together. So it has to be in partnership. And then just the question, I scribbled down something that now I can't even, yes, the therapy. Yeah, I think that in a lot of our Israel conversations, people are really afraid, and we need to be able to hear that fear. And I don't think that the role of the rabbi is just to, a lot of times when people think about Israel in the pulpit, like Andrew said, it's like, what sermon should I give? And not that we shouldn't give sermons, but we also have to teach in other contexts. We need to just bring in people to have conversations, right? There's ways that we can have these conversations that don't involve us always giving it over. And in fact, those are often safer for us. Like, I'm bringing this person, I'm showing this movie, we're reading this book, et cetera, et cetera. We can bring in the vision that we want. And also, yes, we hear people, we hear their fear, and we try to offer a vision that shows that there is a possibility. There's something between. It's not that if anybody says anything critical about Israel, the whole country is going to fall apart, because guess what? It's not. Right? We try to show some other vision that you can have real conversations without the whole country falling apart, without the security being threatened. In fact, I would suggest that the current situation is the greatest threat to its security.
So I want to actually take on the question about the education, the one who said to lead with activism. And at the risk of being the head of an educational institution, I first want to say, yes, more education is better. And yes, exactly what Jill and Rabbi Jacobs said, exactly right. But we shouldn't, and this goes back also, Amy, to your point, we shouldn't let our lack of knowledge incapacitate us in the face of injustice. Whether you think Rabbi Jacobs has the account of the injustice today or others do, and I would just point to other examples. By your what is your name? I'm sorry. Joe. Very informal, that's right. Joe, I would just look at the great mobilizations of activism, and if you're going to hold Israel to the same standard and engagement, you would tell the people in line of at Vietnam rallies, don't get involved until you learn some Vietnamese. Don't get involved until you understand the culture of the state. You would say to China, people that want human rights in China, don't get involved until you can recognize a few Chinese characters. Now, you may think that I'm taking this to a reductio, but I'm really not, because of something that Jill passed over very quickly, that it's important to understand as citizens of the United States, as I presume most of you are, your tax dollars and your government is going to perpetuate policies that you are responsible for as citizens. And either you need to get on board with doubling or sustaining the support that it's giving for the reasons that it's giving it and understand it, or you should do something about it. And I would say that doesn't require you first to learn every language of every foreign country in which America is involved in, least of all, the one that's closest to your heart and that you're mobilized and motivated for. So I just want to say that, yes, education is more important than, it's better to be more educated than not, but you shouldn't let not having education incapacitate you from acting in your responsibilities as democratic citizens of your own country.
I just want to thank Dr. Rehfeld and Rabbi Jacobs for a very, very thoughtful evening. And I know we have a lot to think about: the role of reason in political philosophy, the role of chiyuv and personal relationships in the flourishing of liberal Judaism, and the relationship between liberal Judaism and Israel. So thank you so much, and good night, everyone.